Have you ever thought video game reviews need more theology? If so, you're in the right place. I'm Father Don, and today I'll be giving a spiritual review of Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. When this game first got revealed, I remember being a bit surprised, as it's been a long while since the previous game. I skipped out on the first Space Marine, not because I thought it looked bad, but I think I was just drowning in too many third-person shooters at the time. Games from series such as Gears and Uncharted seemed to be coming out left and right, and I just needed a break. Nonetheless, here I am picking up Space Marine 2. And to be honest, part of the reason I pulled the trigger on this game was because it just looks really impressive. You don't need a game reviewer to tell you that the presentation in this title is top of the line, both in the sweeping vistas and in the sheer amount of action on screen, with massive hordes of enemies and combat bursting with visual effects. If you're looking for a graphical showcase, this game has got you covered. Be warned that those graphics include a lot of graphic violence. And though that violence is mostly directed toward evil alien monstrosities, which is to say, not human beings made in the image and likeness of God, even with that said, Father Don is not exactly recommending that you pick this one up for the kids. I'm going to talk more on that subject, but allow me to come back to it a bit later. The sound design here also delivers, with a fittingly epic score and meaty sound effects. You can really feel those impacts as you wade into the battlefield. The world of Warhammer 40k probably deserves some spiritual analysis. From the Christian perspective, there's plenty that can be said about a fictional universe in which Jesus essentially returns, only he's a semi-immortal space emperor who imposes a theocracy and enlists us into crusading across the stars, doing battle with all manner of foul alien forces. Those evil Xenos. Only we aren't always perfect saints ourselves. So yeah, there's a bigger discussion to be had here, but in this video, I'm looking specifically at Space Marine 2, not at the entire 40k universe. Also note that for the purpose of this review, I'm going to try to avoid story spoilers, and I'll only really be reviewing the single-player campaign, which thankfully can be fully played in co-op. I mentioned Gears of War earlier, and in some ways, Space Marine is like the anti-Gears. I say that because it was largely Gears that popularized the stop-and-pop, cover-based shooter mechanics that kind of took over the genre. In Space Marine, you're not going to be spending much time hiding behind cover. Rather, this game is all about making you feel like a hulking juggernaut, a walking tank, though sometimes also flying. You're going to be stomping, slicing, and blasting through everything in your way, occasionally performing some dodges and parries, but the emphasis here is clearly on playing aggressively. Combat encounters frequently get up close and personal, and there are a lot of times where it actually feels less like a third-person shooter and more like a hack-and-slash action game. Space Marine 2 shares a surprising amount of DNA with titles such as God of War or Devil May Cry. This is both a strength and a weakness. The downside is that if you're expecting third-person combat as deep and satisfying to master as, say, like DMC5, you're not going to find that here. Prior to this, I had recently been playing one of the Batman Arkham games, and simply the lack of being able to swiftly cancel out of your animations, I definitely felt that loss here. In action games like Batman, you see the attack coming, and even if your character is in the middle of another animation, you can often cancel out and respond. But in Space Marine 2, you'll be throwing these heavy, sweeping blows, and sometimes you'll see the enemy's attack coming a mile away, but it kind of doesn't matter because your character has to finish that big animation before you can respond. So you're going to take a hit. It's not a deal breaker, but does take some adjusting to. And likewise, if you're expecting firefights with the same kind of strategic punch as, say, the best games in the Gears series, or especially something like Rainbow Six, this isn't really trying to deliver that either. What Space Marine excels at is just sheer intensity. The action ramps up, and then ramps up again, and then again. And while a number of the encounters are stuffed with what you might call popcorn enemies, like a round of Vampire Survivor, the grand spectacle of it all is really something to behold. It's hard to overstate that spectacle. Comparisons have been made to big-budget action movies, and it really does feel like Space Marine hits with one big, awesome set piece after another. My main fear for this one was that it would end up feeling a bit repetitive before too long. That fear is not totally unfounded, With wave after wave of enemies charging your way, you may feel a bit burnt out by the end of some stages, despite the enemy variety ramping up eventually. But that said, I don't think the quest overstays its welcome. The around 10-hour game length feels about right, and frankly, as an adult, I kind of appreciate the lack of padding. The option of playing through everything on co-op doesn't hurt either. Tonally, you're not really supposed to think too hard about the larger ramifications of the plot here. But with theocracy on the rise in our own world, alongside pushes for transhumanism, one does wonder if the future portrayed by Warhammer 40k is closer to our own reality than we may at first assume. If you're a perceptive person, you probably notice that as Christianity has receded, Western nations are often called post-Christian nowadays, we have steadily become more theocratic, not less. That old fear that any little sin could cost you your freedom, that's made a big comeback in the modern world through things like cancel culture, deplatforming, debanking. You might post something deemed inappropriate on social media and suddenly find the Inquisition knocking at your door. You could lose your career, or depending on where you live, you could even end up doing hard time. We don't call it blasphemy or heresy. We have new, politically correct terms for such things today. But the effect is the same. Just think for a moment about laws prohibiting hate speech. When the government starts telling you not only what you can or cannot do, but what is sacred, so sacred that none dare speak a word against it. When you're told what you must love or must not hate. When the state begins legislating matters of the heart. Then are you sure that the separation of church and state still really exists? Is that what a secular democratic republic does? Or is that what a theocracy does? But that's only natural, you may say. If the church fades, something must fill the void. Why not the state? And shouldn't you be more concerned about why Christianity is in retreat, is receding in the first place? The answer to that question is bigger than the scope of this review. But going back to a subject I touched on earlier, the violence and death so gratuitously on display in a game like Space Marine 2, I would put to you that while the glorification of violence can indeed be a dangerous thing, what is perhaps more dangerous, and definitely more ignored by modern Christians, is the opposite error, the refusal to look death in the face. At my parish, we have a lot of young families, but I'm quite aware that that is not the norm. At the average Catholic parish, well, it can feel like a sea of gray heads, right? The parishioners are largely the elderly. That's not only because of different cultural, generational values. As you get older and as you realize, I'm closer now to my death than to my birth, and you witness friends and loved ones pass away, it naturally gets you thinking about those ultimate questions, thinking about God and the afterlife more seriously. In the book of Ecclesiastes, we read, "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come." Don't wait, in other words, until you're at death's doorstep before you start thinking seriously about those ultimate things. In some cultures, they try to inculcate this by exposing young people to death, even at a fairly tender age. You have the Day of the Dead in Mexico and other similar practices in parts of Asia. And to be sure, there is such a thing as going too far. We do have to be careful here. But again, in our Western culture today, our error tends to be in the opposite direction, as if to banish all thought of death from the young. That's so far away, it's of no concern. Just think happy thoughts. We forget that for many centuries, our children's stories were largely the lives of the saints, including many martyrs, with the details of how they died not hidden away. One of the saddest situations I recall from when I was helping out at a hospice center some years ago involved a certain gentleman who was nearing death, but the family, they were so intent on keeping that reality from him. "We're telling him that he's still at the hospital, not at hospice," they explained. "No last rites, no prayers like that. We don't want him to have to think about death." And sure, they thought they were being kind, but that sort of kindness struck me as very cruel. We need to have the wisdom and the courage to look death in the face, and we need to do so before we're as old as Lieutenant Titus in Space Marine 2. That's all I've got for you today. May you go with God. May you like and subscribe, and may we pray for one another until we meet again.